These are the materials that you will need for the enzyme catalase lab. All of these materials are for part A, which deals with temperature, or part B, which deals with pH. Depending on what part you have, you will be using only some of these materials. These materials include the potato catalase, which is the enzyme we will be using today, calculator, 3 test tubes, a 3 milliliter syringe, a marker and tape to label the test tubes, and hydrogen peroxide. For temperature, you will be using regular water on an ice bath and hot water on a hot plate. If you will be using the pH, you'll be using sodium hydroxide and hydrogen chloride. There are certain safety concerns with this lab. We will be using glass from the test tubes. Be sure to handle them carefully so they do not break. We will also be handling thermometers, which are as well made of glass, along with the 3 beakers. Temperature also has other considerations. Make sure to not burn yourself and using proper hot handling techniques. We are using chemicals in addition to the hydrogen peroxide. Be sure, if you are doing the pH lab, to be very careful with the chemicals you are using. These are how your test tubes should be labeled. For temperature, you will see all the labels on the tops of the labels, labeled hot, cold, or room temperature. And if you're dealing with pH, they will be labeled either acid, base, or pH 7. You will remove 3 milliliters of potato catalase and place 3 milliliters into all 3 test tubes. Be sure to thoroughly rinse out the syringe after you are finished. For part A, doing the effective temperature, you will place the test tube labeled hot into the hot water beaker, the test tube labeled cold into the cold water beaker, and the test tube labeled room temperature on the test tube rack. Leave each of the test tubes in place for 3 minutes using the stopwatch in your bin to keep track of the time. After 3 minutes, you will remove the test tubes from the hot or the cold water beakers. Use the test tube tongs during this part, especially for the hot water beaker. You do not want to burn yourself. This is a safety consideration. You will place those test tubes into the test tube rack and use the thermometer very, very quickly to measure the temperature of each test tube. Be sure to record that temperature in Table 1 of your lab aids notebook. After the temperatures have been recorded, you will take the syringe that you used to put the enzyme catalase in the test tubes and measure out 3 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide into each tube. After they have been added, wait 1 minute using the stopwatch, and then you will record the height of the bubbles. Be sure when you are recording the height of the bubbles to use the centimeters side and not the inches side for more accurate data. You will also measure the radius of the test tube in centimeters. If you can't get the radius, start with the diameter and then divide by 2. If you are doing the acid-base procedure instead of the temperature procedure, after you put the 3 milliliters of potato catalase into each test tube, you will then add 10 drops of either hydrogen chloride, sodium hydroxide, or distilled water to the appropriate tube. You will then use the stopwatch and wait 2 minutes. After those 2 minutes, you will add 3 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide to each test tube. You will wait 1 minute for this reaction to occur. You will then measure the height of the bubbles in centimeters using the ruler in your basket. Be sure to also measure the radius of the test tube in centimeters. And like I said before, if you cannot get the radius accurately, measure the diameter to begin with, and then divide by 2. After all of your data has been recorded in your data table, you will completely clean up your lab stations. You will not get a stamp until all of your materials have been washed out with soap and water, dried off, placed back in the baskets, and your lab station completely wiped down and dry. If you performed Part A, you will get data from people who performed Part B, And if you performed part B, you will get the data from people who joined or who performed part A. Join up with those groups, get the data tables, and then you will complete graphs depicting what your data shows.